deregulation across the government as a whole, and an education system overhaul. So these all affect the workforce in a pretty significant way. And the key distinction in a lot of these that we'll break down are going to be short-term and long-term. So if we start here with the government layoffs and agency consolidation. So we'll kind of present the extreme scenario. So head of Doge is Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek famously is shooting to have a 75% reduction in workforce of government employees. So there's the good side here, which is reduce government expenditure significantly, which now if we maintain the same revenue or even increase it or, swap it in those capacities, then now we start to make the U.S. a more powerful economy because we can start to make up the debt. But from the job market perspective, the short-term downside of this is significantly increased workforce supply. Again, we're a lot of the economy in general, whether it's macro or micro, is supply and demand. So by increasing the workforce supply, the demand isn't going to change for some time. So now you just have increased competition. You might even have a level of wage stagnation or even wage decrease. Again, right? What happens with supply and demand? If you have super high demand for jobs with low supply, the people that are now fulfilling it usually make more money. Flip side, you have super high supply with really low demand or a stagnating demand, then now your kind of wages and costs and negotiation power decrease. So this is the short-term issue with the government layoffs. And again, this goes back to implementation because I've heard a couple different ways of this being done and proposed, and we'll kind of break these down. So if we had the significant layoff scenario, the most effective way that I think would be the least short-term impacting would be the mass layoff with a severance package of like a 2-year payoff scenario that is either, it's essentially trickled out over on your standard pay cycle for the government people. And the other thing that I've heard to incentivize people to try to land a job or re-enter the workforce quickly is that when you land a job, you would just get all of that at once. So the government still pays the same amount of money over the grand scheme. Now, there's a short-term macroeconomic hit because you would increase the government spending within the given calendar or fiscal year. But you know that, it's a counting clock from effectively like, okay, in 24 months from now, government spending is about to plummet. So that's one way that I heard, right? Again, so you still are incentivizing people to land a job, but I think that some people are going to go on sabbatical. They're going to relax. They're going to take a few months, maybe even take the full 2 years. So it will not, just jolt that supply of workforce like it would if everybody was just laid off and told to go figure it out tomorrow. As well as I think that would be a real downside because it would decrease revenue for most companies because a significant chunk of your workforce, your customer base of government employees as everyday consumers now doesn't have the money to spend either. So I think it's just a lose-lose overall if you don't do something like this. I have heard just the general layoff scenario proposed by some people. And like I said, I already presented that. I think that's a lose-lose. You lose money in the economy, you lose revenue for companies, and at the same time, increasing supply of workforce and decreasing demand of goods. And that's just a recipe for disaster. So I don't think that that's going to happen. And that would not be ideal. So the implementation really is going to be the effective thing here. But in the long term, this also should almost in every given scenario end up in a win. And the reason being is because the government doesn't generate revenue. It doesn't make money. It doesn't make the consumer's life any better. There is no good or service that they create per se. So by taking this giant workforce displacement, putting it into the private sector, your production is now going to significantly increase. And again, we couple this with the way that tariffs can be implemented and you have a level of supply or demand increase, which means you need more supply. Then now you have more productive people in society producing more things and producing more value, which means you can deliver more. And so now you have a significant, we'll say GDP growth, a significant output increase in what we are doing. And so in the long term, companies should be winning from a revenue and profit perspective, by having more people to do more things and increase the demand and selling and market penetration globally. So in the long run, this should almost always end up in a positive scenario, but there could be that potential for the short-term pain due to the increased workforce supply. Now, the other aspect, so deregulation. So this is one that more often than not should just flat out end up in increased company revenue and increased reinvestment. Again, a lot of the deregulation efforts that were attempted to happen in Trump's previous administration not necessarily came to fruition. But again, if we keep with the same benchmark of 20% operational savings, go reinvest it into workforce and technology, that is what deregulation is going to do. So and this also has the other positive benefit of allowing your money to go farther. I definitely am going to blank here, but there was a big study done of Fortune 500 companies. It was in the early 2020s. It was, I believe it was during COVID, maybe it was right after COVID, that essentially said, what is your biggest preventative for doing business? And it is regulation. It's not cost of doing goods. It's not supply of workforce. It's not sourcing goods. It's not any of this stuff. It really was the regulation aspect is what most companies said, agnostic of their industry. So by taking their shackles off of deregulation, then they have more money to spend on more people and produce more goods. You also get more R&D because they can test out new products. And does this mean that some things are going to flop? Does this mean that there's going to be, potentially some safety issues from time to time? There might be, but all of that will be market corrected. So I think that the overall short and long term of deregulation is a win-win. And I think this has been shown historically when you look at, for instance, the Reagan administration. If you go back to FDR and you look at the regulation increases there, you had a negative impact from regulation increase. If you look at the most prosperous times in the U.S. history, from the late 1800s to the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, you had a stagnation of regulation or a decrease. So there's just so many times in history where deregulation usually leads to a win-win across the board because goods are cheaper, so people are spending more money, which means higher revenue generation, more job creation. You have companies who are saving money, taking that money and reinvesting a portion of it back into the workforce and technology as well. So deregulation, again, done correctly and done well, there's always this caveat with everything, should just really end up in a net positive. I don't really see how this could negatively impact the job market itself. Now, the only way that this really could is if you have major companies violating social and societal values. For instance, if you deregulate environmental and you end up, polluting a significant chunk of a given forest or a given body of water, and this just causes your reputation to tank and that company falters, then that would be like the level of job market impact. But unless it's a sector of the economy or product production that is only done by this one company, which is almost never the case, then it's just going to shift to another company. It's going to shift to a different market competitor. It's just going to shift somewhere else where that money is being spent and how people are fulfilling the need that the one company violated what we want as a social company or as a society of what we want companies to uphold from good moral values. So I think the deregulation just across the board from a job market specific perspective does not really have the ability to negatively impact short or long term. I think this is just pure positive for job market only. Again, not saying deregulation is 100% a positive thing all the time. The scope of this video is job market. And the last one from Doge is the education system overhaul. And so this is an interesting one because the details aren't necessarily there. The biggest thing that we know is they want to abolish the Department of Education at the federal level. So this one is going to be interesting. I almost see no short-term benefit or negative at all. When you really look at what the federal education system does, they don't standardize the curriculum. They don't standardize anything of what people learn. They simply produce funding. That's it. That's really what their job is to provide funding from at the federal level to the given states. If you continue to enable states to produce their curriculums, spend their education money how they want, and you really create a marketplace of competition within education, then this is going to take a long time to realize these effects. But this is why I worded it as education system overhaul, is when you remove the federal barrier, then now you have states and individual schools competing with each other. You don't have this crazy government funding going to your Ivy League and not, D2 or D3 schools, or, those sort of lesser schools, or the athletic programs getting a significant boost from the government and not actually making money off of their actual athletic program. And so I think that this makes a significantly more competitive and effective education system in the long run, which should lead to a more productive workforce sooner. Because anybody that is from a manager or higher, like you have been a part of hiring, firing, performance reviews, etc. So I'm not going to necessarily put an age point here, but I'm going to put that prerequisite. You have been a manager or higher in your given career, potentially even supervisor. The amount of people that we can all admit that we have seen that are fresh graduates, 22, 24, 26, 28, whatever, and are just utterly useless in the economy and their job market is asinine. It is off the charts. So the education system needs some form of overhaul to increase the effectiveness. And right now, there's no incentive to. A lot of the top universities get most of their money from the government, not even necessarily tuition, and also the athletic programs. And so, what's the point? Where if you are competing and you sit here, and I'm going to throw out a completely hypothetical. But if you're looking at maybe like Virginia Tech, which is a top engineering school, but it's not Ivy League, they come out and because, they lose this oversight, they now have a little bit more freedom, they negotiate with the states, and they start producing 90% of our graduates come out and are earning six figures within 24 months. And then you got Harvard, a current Ivy League top school, they come out and 70% of their graduates are coming out with six-figure salaries in 24 months. Where are you going to go? Right? If you actually make universities compete and spend their money effectively, same thing with the K through 12 scenario. If you do something like a school choice, where you allow people to pick their high school, pick their middle school, etc., and kind of pick the better one in the area, and certain schools are losing their students, which means that they don't have the funding. They, teachers start to have to go to work for other schools. Those schools have to expand because they're more effective. In order for those teachers to actually work there, they have to be better teachers so that it just creates this vicious cycle of when you make the education system competitive and based on results, that you actually end up with the best education system possible. I think you end up with a workforce production increase. This is, like I said, no short term at all. I think the abolishment of the education system, the only short term benefit is the money saving from the government itself. But I don't think it's going to have the workforce impact until the education system itself has gone through that overhaul. So recap here, big three from Doge and kind of the short and long-term benefits here. So you got the government layoffs and agency consolidation. So by doing this, you're going to increase the workforce supply, which in the long run should always win because workforce increase from a supply perspective means more production, which means more revenue, which means more expansion, and also more demand because more people are making more money and working. Now, the short term is sort of that 50-50 scenario. So in the short term, it depends on how they do it. If they do what they've, what some people have proposed of saying, hey, we're going to do a 2-year pay cycle severance package, then it's not going to be as jolting because some people are going to take longer to re-enter the workforce. Some people are going to enjoy that money and some people are going to re-enter immediately. But so the short term is almost guaranteed actually like a somewhat negative impact because you have the workforce increase, whether it's 10% of people choose to go back immediately or 100%. I think that's where the implementation can vary. And as well as from a macroeconomics perspective, if you do pull this off, then you're also decreasing the operating revenue of the government itself, which therefore would theoretically lead to smaller deficits, debt reduction, and would give us more leverage in the overall negotiations of the global economy. So, but again, that stuff isn't realized for longer. Deregulation, I almost see no negative to this from a workforce job outlook perspective. This should almost guaranteed 100% of the time lead to increased jobs because there's increased revenue, more R&D, faster company expansion, which then just means that they're going to hire more people, expand their markets, expand the production facilities, etc. And then the education system overhaul, essentially eliminating the Federal Department of Education. It's essentially the same thing as the government layoffs from the people perspective, but in the short term, I think it matches that same pros and cons. Long term, this should end up in a huge win because it will spark a more competitive education space, which therefore should lead to a more productive workforce, which means that when this really comes to fruition, and if I had to do a guesstimate here, I'm going to say it's probably going to take 5 to 10 years, that your fresh graduates are much, much, much more useful. So that's how I think that these DOGE changes can come into play. Immigration. So this is one that is very interesting. And again, kind of has that dichotomy of pros, cons, short-term, long-term. So the initial mission with the immigration changes that are up in the upcoming administration is to simply get rid of the criminals that are here illegally. I don't see that having any sort of job market outlook in the grand scheme. If they are criminals, then they're probably not necessarily contributing to taxes or having legally employed jobs, so on and so forth. So I think that's going to be negligible. So the short and long term here is really going to depend on how long it takes them to accomplish that mission before they go on to the next one. Now, the other short term scenario that they want to do immediately is just simply slow down or eliminate the illegal immigration as a whole. Now, this would have a job market outlook because, again, there's a percentage of the illegal immigrants that are going to seek jobs and a percentage that are not. The percentage that are, this is now going to open up some of those lower wage jobs, entry-level jobs that they typically fill within agriculture or manufacturing or, trade labor, these sorts of things that otherwise would be filled by a legal citizen. So this should actually affect the supply side of the workforce, which would mean more job openings. So that aspect, if they are able to slow down or eliminate the illegal immigration, which will probably be slowed down versus elimination as a whole, then that's how that would affect the workforce. Is it theoretically should have more openings for companies to then give to either legal immigrants or just citizens in general. Now, long-term here, this is where it gets very interesting because long-term deportation actually is a decrease of workforce supply. So that should continue that same pro that I gave just a second ago. But it's also a decrease in demand and a decrease in consumption of goods and services as a whole. So this really, I think, is kind of a break even and a trade from an outlook perspective. So this is where I think that really just the short and long-term benefit of the proposed immigration changes between the initial deportation of criminals and then subsequent deportations based on other categories. And then the preventing of illegal immigration, I really think the only job force outlook here is the continuation of the decreasing of supply side workforce. And so I think that that's kind of the key thing to take away with the proposed immigration changes as a whole. So theoretically, more people can be employed. Now, the other aspect is on the deportation front is there has been talk about once they get past that criminal objective to the degree that they are deeming it checked off. What about dreamers? What about the productive people? What about these other aspects? And when it comes to people that are here illegally but are productive, I have heard deport them anyway. I have heard we find a pathway to citizenship, that we figure out a green card scenario. So all of that's up in the air. But again, this could have both short-term and long-term positive and negative. So if they decided to keep everybody, find a pathway to citizenship, green card, whatever the solution might be, but they're allowed to stay, then I think that this just really maintains a lot more of the status quo in terms of whatever the supply side effect is from the deportation that does occur and the preventing of illegal immigration as a whole. That supply side just continues on its path. But if they chose to deport all of these people, then you have a little bit of a nuanced discussion, because again, we're back to that break even of the decreased supply and decreased demand within the economy. But what you're actually at a nuanced discussion of is productivity versus labor cost in this exchange. So if you did have the illegals that they decided to deport, and theoretically that opens up more jobs, so, or, for, either legal immigrants or citizens to fill, great. Let's say you did that one for one, but what is their cost, right? Usually the illegals are operating at a cheaper cost. And so this is sort of like a minimum wage debate to some degree. And so if the labor that you're replacing them with is the same or is more cost, same productivity, consumers actually lose from a job market perspective because revenue is down for companies, so they lose reinvestment. If cost is the same, production is the same, then it's continuing maintaining status quo. It's obvious that if the costs were less of the labor that replaced the illegal immigrants and productivity stayed the same, then that's just a win-win. But we can all admit that's not going to be the case. If you have the more expensive route, which is likely to be the case, and you have increased productivity, then now we're back to that break-even trade-off scenario. So this is one that it's a little bit more nuanced when you go to deport or get the illegals out that are productive members of society in the economy. This is a very nuanced and dicey discussion. And I do think that, they are leaning a little bit more towards finding a way to keep them in the United States and a pathway to citizenship and so on and so forth. So the immigration one, like I said, it's a very interesting scenario. Its biggest potential impact by preventing illegal immigration and deporting, we'll say, non-productive and criminal illegal immigrants in this country, that is going to open up those entry-level, lower-paying jobs for legal immigrants and American citizens. So I think that would overall be a win for the economy in that scenario. But the other aspects of deporting the rest of people or this and that, it's a lot more nuanced and probably more often than not ends up in a net negative from the economy and job market perspective, because revenue would be down due to wages increasing for non-illegal immigrants, as well as cost of goods then going up and less revenue because people aren't paying it more, demand is down, and so on and so on. It just creates this vicious cycle of rising costs, which then decreases demand, which then means that there's less for reinvestment. So I think that immigration, the best case scenario is that preventing of illegal immigration based on the policies they've said, and deporting the non-productive members of society, and that will be a win-win from the economy perspective. Now, another one here that is very interesting that I think a lot of people overlook and that the conversation has not been focused on is how to actually make the military a revenue generation machine. So this is some interesting conversation that I have seen between, I believe, Pete Hegseth, a couple different kind of podcasters and people in the cabinet of Trump and things like that. But and if we also go back to Trump's first term, one of his big revenue boosters in the U.S. from the government perspective to help contribute to decreasing the deficit and the debt and also help with trade relations during his tenure was the NATO negotiations. So, hey, we are going to defend our allies. We absolutely will. But you're going to pay what you were supposed to pay, which was a percentage of your GDP, for us to be there to defend you. And so that's going to be a core piece here to bring back because that has since been eliminated. So some things to kind of note here. So the U.S. has 750 military bases worldwide. Our top 5 troop placements, 53,000 in Japan, 35,000 in Germany, 24,000 in South Korea, 12,500 in Italy, and 10,000 in the UK. These all have the ability to generate revenue, especially when you look at Japan and Germany, where we have significant trade deficits. And I think Japan might be our largest debt holder for us. If not, they're at least like top 2, top 3. We can look at the value of the troops and the military protection we're providing and saying, hey, you're going to eliminate this chunk of our debt. Or because of this, here's what you're going to do from a tariff and taxing perspective on U.S. goods in your country, or so on and so on. It really gives us a negotiation tactic, and I know I just pointed out Japan there because they're the one that has the most troops, and they have, I think out of this list, definitely their largest debt holder, is that here's where we can negotiate and drive supply and demand increases through military protection. Because for better or worse, we are kind of the world police. I'm not going to say that's right or wrong. Again, this is not a political video. This is a job market video. But if we make some trade negotiation deals of saying, hey, you're going to import 10% more U.S. goods for this defense. Okay, that could be huge from a demand perspective, right? If they are continually buying these things. Or, hey, we're going to, for this protection, that's going to get paid for through this, by you reducing the tariff, which makes our goods cheaper, which brings money back into our economy. So we can really use the military, because we're using it from a global protection standpoint, we can parlay that into trade negotiations, which has been talked about as a way to generate the revenue. Or let's just say you don't even want to go that complex. Hey, for these 53,000 soldiers, you're going to pay, I don't know, $20,000 per soldier per month, right? That then increases the revenue to the U.S. Going back to some of the previous discussions we've had, right? This would allow them to decrease government spending effectively and put more people back into the economy, or help contribute to the lesser debt, which gives the U.S. more negotiation power, more global power from an economic perspective, which allows us to use our leverage to increase more demand and increase supply. And so it just creates this vicious cycle. So it could just be that, hey, you're going to make money, or you're going to pay us for the protection, period, end of story. And that in and of itself is going to have an effect on companies' revenue generation and impact. And so it could go a negotiation into trade for military, or just, hey, our military is going to generate revenue, which is then going to lead to decreased deficits, decreased debt, and increased U.S. dollar power, decreased inflation, so on and so forth. Now, and just to give an idea here, we've talked about different billions of dollars here and billions of dollars there, and millions of jobs or thousands of jobs, so on and so forth. Just to give an idea, so the military perspective, so they just had their 7th audit in a row. So they do annual audits now for the last 7 years. And I haven't seen the specific numbers. I know they didn't do well. But just to give you an idea of a military DoD audit, in 2022, fiscal year 2022, they couldn't account for 60% of their military assets, which totaled $3.5 trillion. Okay, that's roughly like 8% of our debt, total debt, that they couldn't account for. So if we turn them into a revenue generation machine and we increase auditing and accountability, this is something to where, again, if we ran math here, let's just say we made up all of that 8%. That means that in roughly 12 years from this one single initiative, well, just from making them get back that 3.5 trillion, in roughly 12 years, we're out of debt. Or at the very least, it might be 15 or something like that, because we might have to make up a little bit of our deficit, and that goes towards that a little bit. And then every year we're in a surplus from this 3.5 trillion. Then you turn them into a revenue generation machine. Now you're talking about a double dip that, the U.S. is out of debt faster. And the U.S. being out of debt, why this matters from a job market perspective, and it's not just a political discussion, is because this is what dictates the value of the U.S. dollar. It dictates inflation. It dictates our leverage in trade negotiations. So as we can decrease our debt, increase the revenue for the government, which is going to come from either revenue generation flat out, aka more sales, which in this case would be taxes. That could either be taxes on people or taxes on other governments. So increasing revenue, or decreasing spending, DOGE, laying off people, deregulation, etc., or a combination of both. That gives us more power, that when we go to the table with a China, Germany, UK, Japan, etc., they don't have the debt looming over our head as a negotiation tactic, but we have their defense. We have the fact that we are the number one or number 2 largest GDP, largest consumer economy in the world that they could lose access to. So many things that really would lead to a decreased cost of goods, increased demand in goods globally, and therefore create those jobs, make your day-to-day life easier, and you're going to spend more money because your day-to-day life is also cheaper, which then leads to more economic growth and a reinvestment across the board. So the military revenue stream is a very interesting one that I think is brushed under the rug for a lot of people to talk about, simply by either holding them accountable or actually making money on our global world police defensive perspective, or reducing that, right? It could be any combination of these three mechanisms could actually lead to significant job growth, because it's overall going to impact our negotiations at the global level and the power of the US dollar.